This episode is brought to you by Indeed. When your computer breaks, you don't wait for it to magically start working again. You fix the problem. So why wait to hire the people your company desperately needs? Use Indeed's sponsored jobs to hire top talent fast. And even better, you only pay for results. There's no need to wait. Speed up your hiring with a $75 sponsored job credit at Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply.
Hello and welcome to Hot Take. I'm Amy Westervelt.
And I'm Mary Anais Tegler. And today we're going to take a look at how the COVID-19 pandemic influenced the way we talk about climate change.
I don't know why you're using the past tense there, Mary. pretty pandemic-y still up in here.
I know. It's just wishful thinking like all the airlines. But at the same time, when the pandemic kicked off, the media kind of did start acting like the climate crisis ended. So...
Oh, yeah, I remember that. Because apparently the media thinks people can't hold two existential threats in our minds at the same time, even though we're living through like three at once.
I mean, just counting conservatively. Also, side eyes and Black women.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, we're going to get into all of that with our guest today, David Wallace Wells.
Yes, we had David on back at the beginning of the pandemic. And since then, he's gone on to do a ton of COVID coverage. So it'll be really interesting to talk to him 2 years plus later.
Oh my God, it's been 2 years?
Yes. Yes. And somehow we've managed to age without maturing.
Oh my God. Yay, us.
David Wallace Wells, welcome back to Hot Take.
Really glad to talk to you guys. I'm really excited about it. Thanks for having me.
Of course. So you are the editor at New York Magazine, but you're soon moving to the New York Times. Is that right?
Yeah, actually, you've got me in like the 1 week between jobs. So probably by the time anyone's listening to this, I'll be already moved to the Times starting next week. Yeah.
That's exciting.
Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah. What are you going to be up to over there?
I'm going to be writing a weekly newsletter as part of the opinion section, which is going to be focused on climate, but not exclusively about climate. Those, something like half or maybe a little less than half, it's not totally clear, of those pieces are going to run as print columns in the print magazine. They'll also show up, this is inside baseball stuff, but they'll also show up on the app and on the website as regular columns. So that to the average reader won't look different than something that Michelle Goldberg or Ross Douthat writes or something. And then I'm supposed to do a couple big cover story kind of pieces for the magazine every year. And I'm hoping beyond that to do other things in other parts of the newspaper too. So maybe some stuff for Sunday Review, maybe some stuff for the book review, maybe some podcasting, who knows. But in general, it's a bit of a blank check, write what you'd like invitation, which it's hard to pass up when the platform is the New York Times and so many people read it and so many people around the world take it so seriously. So hoping that I'll be as independent as I imagine I'll be as it actually unfolds. But at the moment, at the outset, it feels like sort of an ideal setup to me, at least.
Well, David, we will be happy to have you on when you leave the New York Times for censorship. No, I'm just kidding.
I'll be counting on you. Don't worry. Yeah.
So when we had you back on, it was the early days of the COVID pandemic, and we were talking about how people were coming to us since we had backgrounds in climate change and being like, so what's the deal with the pandemic? And we were all like, I don't know. I'm just as scared as you are.
Yeah.
Do you remember that?
It's been a crazy couple of years. It's hard. In some ways, it feels like 2 months ago that we last talked, and in other ways, a whole nother lifetime.
Well, and you've gone on to actually cover COVID quite a bit since then, too. So I imagine it's hard to remember not knowing that much about it.
Yeah, and I think the weird thing about it is that it's unlike what we may have thought at the very outset of the pandemic. It's, probably not going to ever leave us. So I can't remember not knowing about COVID, and I may never, for the rest of my life, not be thinking about COVID. And that's, on some level, also how I feel about, my own climate awakening. I think it's how a lot of people feel about climate change. So I'm sure we're here to talk about parallels. That's one of a billion parallels and contrasts to draw.
If the pandemic ended tomorrow and COVID was wiped off the face of the earth tomorrow, I would think about this for the rest of my entire life. This has just been such a huge trauma. So
Yeah, I think it's, in a weird way, even though it's on some level the only thing that we've been talking about for a couple of years, or like the biggest thing that we've been talking about for a couple of years, I think we also, very few of us, maybe even none of us, really like have been able to wrap our heads around what happened, what we went through. And I do think we're all going to be sort of like reckoning with that, what it revealed about us, what it revealed about our politics, what it changed about us, what it changed about our interpersonal relationships, how it both reflected our intuitive sense of risk and also will be shaping our future sense of risk going forward. I think it's really, really quite profound and will be quite profound at sort of every level of social and political organization, from the smallest individual unit all the way up to our geopolitics. And, I the last piece I wrote for New York Magazine before I left was on, looking at this particular approach to calculating COVID mortality called excess mortality, which is basically like, very simply, you count or estimate the number of people who died in a year, and then you compare it to the average over the years before the pandemic. So it's a sort of a catch-all statistic that doesn't depend on how much testing you're doing or the age skew of your population or that sort of thing. And in that piece, I was sort of just stumbled on the fact that among the large countries of the world, the country that had the worst pandemic was Russia, which is like just another reminder that these are, like climate change, these are not stories or disruptions that can be compartmentalized or segmented off from the rest of our lives, or that they are just sending constant shockwaves through everything else that we want to preserve as normal, even as it gets harder and harder to do that.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, we definitely want to get into some more of that later, but before we do, I just have a quick question. How can you tell if it's a dogwood tree?
Is this like a bad pun that's coming to smack me in the face? I have no idea.
Okay, first of all, my puns are amazing.
Well, Mary, you know that when someone says a pun is bad, they mean that it's good. There's no such thing as, it's the same word, actually, when it comes to puns.
Okay, you're stalling.
What is it again, Mary? Repeat the question.
How can you tell if it's a dogwood tree?
I give up.
Oh, the bark.
Exactly.
Pretty good.
Amy,
right? I actually
Amy got it.
Oh,
You
man.
got it.
David, you don't know. I'm like 0 for 100 right now.
You've been trained. No, you're 1 for 100.
So at the start of 2020, it really felt like the media was looking at the climate story differently. It was looking at it for the better. And the climate coverage numbers were way up, not where they should be, but going in the right direction. And with the school strikes and so many other mobilizations, it felt like the momentum was finally there. And then COVID came and it just plummeted. And there became this pervasive narrative that now wasn't the time to talk about climate change, and all resources and attention needed to go to the pandemic.
That's so crazy to me, actually, that I had forgotten that like the school strikes had really just started to pick up steam before the pandemic got going. Oof.
Yeah.
But I remember us talking about how like if I were going to engineer, poking a hole in the balloon of the youth climate movement, it would be that pandemic.
Right.
Well, not just the youth climate movement. It felt, bigger than that. I mean, I think that was one of the driving forces for climate awareness, climate, a sense of climate urgency and climate commitment. Like the strikers were a huge part of that story, but it was also much bigger than them. You saw hypocritical corporate leaders and prime ministers and presidents who, were feeling pushed pretty quickly to, at least on the rhetorical level, relatively extreme positions on climate. And we can talk about, what's happened over the last couple of years, but it does feel considerably less front and center on the global agenda than it did back then.
Yeah.
And even as a lot of progress has been made over the last couple of years, I would say, but we're very much in a different cultural moment. There was like a real high tide of climate urgency and anxiety, I would say, at that time. And now we're in a place where, everybody sees it differently in different parts of the world. Different populations have sort of moved at different paces on this. But it seems to me if you are to generalize it, you have to say that we've sort of settled into an understanding that some pretty bad climate change is baked in without having the same anger or anxiety about it that we had a couple of years ago before the pandemic. It's been sort of a period of normalization, you know?
Yeah, I think that's right. And it's concerning, you know?
Yeah. It's kind of like the pandemic usurped climate change as the big existential threat, right? Like it became the thing that threatens all of us and therefore the thing that we all need to like drop everything to work on. And climate change had just gotten that type of recognition starting in 2018. So it just like had 1 year where it felt like the most important thing. And that 1 year happened to be while the country was being run by Trump. So yeah, of course not. They're pouring gasoline on the fire. And like once COVID comes around, climate reporters start getting taken off the climate beat. And this is like right after so many outlets were like, in 2019, we're really going to cover the climate story. We mean it this time. And then the pandemic comes along and they're just like, nope, you're going to go cover the COVID beat because they both deal with numbers and science in some way. You know, I remember having a really hard time pitching climate stories anywhere. And David, it seems like you actually did float into the COVID beat for a while. You were kind of COVID and climate for a second there. I'm wondering if there are any interesting trends you saw or questions that you came across that surprised you.
On what side of it? How do you mean?
All sides of it, actually. But I guess more going into COVID from climate. Like, was it hard for you to pick up that story, for example?
You know, it was the only thing that I was thinking about for a period of a couple of months. And I think in that way I was not unusual, even just in the general public. I think it was a quite overwhelming and onrushing experience to be dragged from a sense of normalcy into a regular daily, like, panic state. And as a result, stories started suggesting themselves, areas of inquiry started suggesting themselves. And it was, to me, sort of a great piece of luck that I'm a journalist. I can like call up somebody and actually get them to answer my phone calls and actually get them to answer my questions. This is like really pretty great if there's this complicated, confusing, in some ways mysterious contagion that's spreading. And there are some people who understand it better than others, but they're not the people who are like front and center in front of the public. And so in that sense, it felt pretty comfortably parallel. I understand all the ways in which you're saying it feels so distinct and weird that anyone would have the expectation that one could jump from an expertise in one to an expertise in the other. But it didn't seem that hard for me to do or unusual to do. And I did, right from the start, think a lot about the lessons that the pandemic had for the story of climate change and the way that we think about it and the way that we respond to it, the way that we prepare or fail to prepare. And, you know, I had a number of different frameworks that I used in thinking, in making those comparisons over the course of the past couple of years. And some of them were more encouraging and some of them were more dispiriting. And we can talk about them sort of one by one if that's useful. But the one that I come back to now, 2+ years in, is that, you know, in early 2021, the IMF published this study that said that it would cost $50 billion to vaccinate the entire world, and that the payback, the return on that investment by just 2025 would be $9 trillion. So it would be something like 100-fold payback in 4 years' time for, by the standards of the US budget, or even by the standards of the US pandemic response, was a trifling sum of $50 billion. Mm-hmm. And we didn't do it. And we didn't even think seriously about doing it. And we didn't even debate it. And it may be the case that those numbers are a little off, like it may have been a little more complicated, a little more expensive than $50 billion. And maybe the payback wouldn't have been quite as, large as they estimated, especially because, variants and all that stuff. But the basic idea that we had the tools that we needed to protect the whole world, we had the money to spend to make that investment. We knew that we would be swimming in the returns, even if you were just looking at the returns within the borders of the United States. The U.S. share of those global returns would have been significant enough that it would have made it a laughably easy investment if you were making those choices from a strict cost-benefit perspective. And yet we basically, as a culture, as a country, and as a collection of like-minded countries, that is to say like the wealthy OECD countries, we weren't even interested in trying to do that. We basically got excited about this miraculous technology, these vaccines which work incredibly well. And then as soon as we got them ourselves, we were just over providing anything for the rest of the world. And when I say we, I don't mean like every single American or every single Brit. I literally mean like into the arms of the people who are thinking about this stuff. Because in all of these countries, there were tons of people who weren't all that well protected, all that well vaccinated. And we sort of turned our backs on them too, and started thinking in the wealthy parts of the world that if you were unvaccinated, that your death was your fault or whatever. And in all of those ways, I just felt the pandemic was teaching us a really, really ugly lesson about the way that we defined progress and possibility almost exclusively through an individual model of risk and safety. And that any approach that extended beyond just securing my own personal well-being was not just too much to ask, but it was almost like, this gets me to like some ugly places when I start thinking about it, but I start thinking, it's like, is there something that makes rich people in rich countries happy to see poor people in poor countries suffering and dying? Like, why wouldn't we pursue a global vaccination strategy? We would all be better off.
Right.
Like, what possible explanation could there be at like a fundamental psychological level for failing to make that investment? It wasn't a big upfront cost. The returns were ginormous compared to the upfront costs. They would come back to benefit even the rich people who made the investment. Like, you didn't need to make the argument on humanitarian grounds at all. And yet we didn't even sniff around that project. We were just like, no, so long as like everybody I know in, Manhattan is vaccinated, and we don't need to worry about, taking those next steps. And it's just, when you apply that same framework to the climate crisis, it's really depressing. It's also just sort of eerily similar to the way that we've been proceeding to this point, which is like, there is progress. It's true. We're making progress in a number of different ways, both on the mitigation and adaptation front. But, if you're hoping that progress and that protection is going to extend to like the 7 or 8 or 10 billion people on the planet who are facing these challenges, that's a huge leap that I think we're very, very far from making. I think it seems given everything we know about climate progress, sort of foolish to expect anything like that to happen. What a disaster. What a moral disaster.
Yeah.
Really was expecting you to say shit show.
Yeah, I mean, on some level it's like, but then it was always thus, right? It's like, it makes me wonder if I was naive to ever expect anything different. And that's like, one of my first, I think we may have even talked about this when we talked a couple of years ago about the pandemic. One of my first feelings about the pandemic response was, for all its imperfections, the world changed really quickly. The world, the world, we buckled in, we bunkered down, and, in a lot of ways that maybe in retrospect, we would have liked to make those choices differently, design those, responses differently. But like, the scale of the response was huge, and the speed of the response was, by global standards, almost instantaneous. And there was part of me that in that early phase of the pandemic was thinking, okay, yes, we have some incredibly, not just incompetent leaders, not just in the US, but all around the world, but also leaders who were, to some degree sociopathic. These are not the people you'd want to have in power when the entire planet was facing generationally unprecedented crisis. And yet, even despite our political problems and our geopolitical problems, we basically spent a couple of months there in the spring of 2020 taking global collective action to protect one another. And I found that pretty inspiring. And I found it inspiring for climate too, and hoped, maybe we could learn from this. But I think what we've been through over the last couple of years, it just makes it seem pretty clear to me, at least, that, as I was saying before, that the big story here is normalization, and that, we came to define much more suffering and death from the pandemic as acceptable and indeed even normal, especially if it was distant from us, distant ideologically, distant internationally, whatever it was. And how quickly that happened, how quickly we went from being like, oh my God, 1,000 people died to, oh, look, 1 million people died in the US.
Yeah, I have no clue.
Right. I don't know what you think of this. I'm totally, I'm just thinking out loud. So if you think I'm way off base, please tell me. I've been looking at this over especially the last year or so, I would say, as like a real fundamental flaw in the social contract, particularly in the US. But I also feel like America's worst / like most impactful export has been this flavor of individualism. You know, maybe I'm being too hard on the US, but I think that it was pretty unique to us for a while. And now I see it in all these other places. And I'm like, man, I really was hoping it would be the other way, that like the US would get infected with some flavor of collectivism, you know?
Mm-hmm.
But
well, it's really interesting to me. I mean, that's certainly one of these stories is like when you think about, you know, in the US on the left for a long time, we talked about the social welfare states of Northern Europe, Scandinavia, as being really admirably generous and universal and, you know, just enviable in almost every way. And
right.
When the pandemic hit,
the bloom is off the rose of Sweden after the pandemic.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's that part of it, which is, they basically took almost no official measures at all to limit the spread of the disease. But there's also, you know, when you get beyond or a little bit deeper than just looking at those outlier cases, it's like all of these rich countries really failed in 2020 to protect their populations. And in the US, you know, we often talked about how bad our response is, how bad Trump was, and it was, and he was, of course. But we were like, depending on what metric you want to use, we were like in the zone of all the European countries, and all of them were terrible here. And I think part of that has to do with what you're talking about, not just, I mean, there's the sort of general social contract, but even on a more micro level, literally, like we have health systems that are essentially organized around providing for the sort of extreme end-of-life care of rich people.
Right.
And are not nearly as robustly developed to like provide basic public health information and guidance and tools, but also meds and making sure there are hospital beds available for everyone. And like all of those things that you actually can see in some ways in poorer countries working better, we failed to deliver on, again, not just in the US, but in all of these countries that are sort of like culturally like the US in one way or another. One thing I find really interesting is thinking about the story of 2021 in contrast to the story of 2020, because in 2020, you know, before we had vaccines, basically none of the rich countries of the world did quote unquote well. You know, you can maybe make a case for Iceland, you can make a case for Finland, but, you know, compared to what happened in Hong Kong or South Korea or New Zealand or Australia, even those good, rich, European countries did really poorly. And in 2021, the story was really pretty different. It was like all of the European countries got everybody vaccinated, or at least got all their elderly people vaccinated. And so they were able to withstand and, you know, survive the pandemic much more comfortably. And in the US, we just didn't. So like in the US, we were like in a crew of failure in 2020. And in 2021, we were like uniquely failing, despite the fact that we had basically invented these vaccines. And I know this feels like old news, like, oh yes, American vaccination rates are low, but it is really, when you get down to it, crazy for the reason that you were talking about, Amy, which is like, this is the solution. This is how you deal with a pandemic, by thinking about it in terms of individual risk. You provide people vaccines. Like if you are a country that is obsessed with navigating the terrain of you know, disruption and disaster and you know, existential threat through individual calculations of individual risk, like the vaccine is the best tool to provide to those people. Right. And yet we couldn't even manage to take it up at anything like our peer countries' levels, even though it should be perfectly suited to our brokenness. It should be
selfishness.
Like,
I know, you're right.
Yeah.
But I almost feel like people took it as somehow being an infringement on individual freedom. It was framed as like something that you do to keep the herd healthy, you know?
Yeah.
And not as something that will give you back your life. It was one of many, many, many examples in 2021, where I was like, Joe Biden thinks that we're living in a totally different era, where like you can lean on these, quote unquote civic responsibility, of Americans to like do the right thing and come together. I'm like, that is just not the country you're running, sir.
Yeah.
Look around, look around.
And I mean, on that point, I've been really struck. I don't know how you guys feel, but just, anecdotally, socially, it's like, this is not just about like crazy Republicans in red states. It's like, I know so many liberals who spent 2020 insisting that the main goal of our lives was to protect the most vulnerable people around us. And then when the vaccines came around, they were like, people who are vulnerable, that's on them. I'm going to go live my life.
Yeah.
And I was like, wait, hang on. What happened here? Like, that is a crazy reversal of political principle that was processed as no reversal at all by all of them. And it says something pretty ugly about our culture that's maybe even deeper than the sort of partisan divides that we obsess over so much.
Yeah, I got to say, that was one of the things that scared me the most when the pandemic rolled around. And I totally saw that coming because at the same time that, like, the liberals were like, we're the ones who care about people and we wear masks because we care about people. We're socially distancing because we care about people. They were also, all of these signs around town about like, if you're running without a mask on, I'll throw a television at you. I feel like the pandemic has really damaged the social fabric of our society, and we desperately need that if we are going to fight climate change or any other existential threat in the future. So yeah, that's deeply concerning.
And you look at if you remember back to coverage in the early days of the pandemic, spring, summer 2020, there was a lot of coverage in the mainstream media about these racial and class disparities in terms of death rates. This was like a big part of the story in 2020. And it's basically disappeared as part of the way that people talk about the pandemic in 2021. And we've replaced it with this incredibly ideological lens in which we talk about red COVID and the death rates in red states. And, again, I don't want to minimize that. Conservative leaders have been really terrible here. It is definitely the case that conservative places, conservative states, conservative counties have lower vaccination rates and as a result higher death rates, and that's terrible. But they're not, the gaps between the bluest states and the reddest states are not meaningfully bigger than the gaps between educational levels, between income levels, and between racial groups. We have all of these still really deeply problematic gaps in our country, and we choose to highlight some of them sometimes, but not in a consistent way. And it really worries me that we're turning away from those. If there's someone who's poor and didn't go to college is dramatically less likely to be vaccinated than someone who's rich and went to college. That's a really big problem that we should be trying to solve through social policy and public messaging, not just by saying, as Joe Biden, the president of the United States, literally said at some point, for the unvaccinated, it's going to be a world of pain or whatever he said. And it's wait, hang on a second. It's not all just Ben Shapiro out there not getting vaccinated. It's there are a lot of people who are skeptical of the public health, of healthcare in general. They don't have all that much experience of it because they've been deprived access. There's so many reasons why people have failed to protect themselves in the way that we might hope that they would. And it just is so simplistic and just sort of dispiriting to lay it all on the feet of partisanship. That's a big problem, but it's not at all the whole problem.
Exactly.
And I think about that when it comes to climate change too. It's yes, obviously, partisanship is a really big problem when it comes to climate action. But by the way, if Joe Manchin was a slightly different person, we'd have a climate bill that was a law now.
100%. I feel like we've really seen that in the last couple of years. Unfortunately, that is the big message to, I think, especially young voters right now. Is Democrats won't do any better on climate.
Yeah.
Which is not a good message.
Yeah. It's our whole system has been kind of stepped on. And do you know what the grape did when it got stepped on?
Oh God, Mary. Did it whine?
Yes.
Oh my God.
It let out a little whine. Okay, wow. You gotta let the guests get some.
I'm sorry.
Amy, you gotta maybe text me the answers to the next one.
I know.
You're in a roll.
I will.
Okay, no more cheating.
I've never gotten this many ever.
Hey, it's Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. Now, I was looking for fun ways to tell you that Mint's offer of unlimited premium wireless for $15 a month is back. So I thought it would be fun if we made $15 bills. But it turns out that's very illegal. So there goes my big idea for the commercial. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. New customer offer for first 3 months only. Speed slow after 35 gigabytes if network's busy. Taxes and fees extra. See mintmobile.com.
Hey, Fidelity. How can I remember to invest every month?
With the Fidelity app, you can choose a schedule and set up recurring investments in stocks and ETFs.
Oh, that sounds easier than I thought.
You got this.
Yeah, I do. Now, where did I put my keys?
You will find them where you left them.
Investing involves risk, including risk of loss. Fidelity Brokerage Services, LLC, member NYSE, SIPC.
So one of the things that was a constant refrain in the first few months of the pandemic was this "we are the virus" idea. Nature is healing and all of that. I guess I wonder, David, how you saw that narrative kind of playing out over the course of the pandemic. I think we now know conclusively nature did not heal.
Nope, it didn't.
But I'm curious just how you kind of saw that playing out and also, you know, where that intersects with some of these same kind of tendencies that we were just talking about, which really feel like, you know, eugenics / ecofascism, you know, having a handshake.
Yeah, right.
You know? So yeah, I'm curious at what you saw as you were reporting on kind of both of these things over the past couple of years, how you saw that kind of framing evolve.
Well, you know, I basically, in my like corner of the social media universe, I saw relatively quickly all those people making those cases like getting dunked on and made fun of. But I do think that for the brief period when those memes were really like all over the place, they did teach us something. They did tell us something, or a few things. You know, they reminded us like how much effort is required to maintain a system that pollutes the environment to the extent that it does, that keeps, you know, wildlife out of our backyards and our back alleys and that kind of thing. That like we are basically fighting kind of a constant war against some of these forces to allow us to live in the illusion that we live in post-natural landscapes. And letting up our guard on that just a little meant that like we did see pretty quickly some signs of like bounce back. And that just shows how aggressively we've been fighting that war all along. And which, you know, I think a lot of people just sort of took as a steady, settled state of conditions rather than one that had to be routinely maintained through sort of aggressive action. And, you know, another lesson that's sort of related is like, you know, the global economy like really shut down for, depending on how you want to count it, like at least a couple of months, and was in a diminished state for basically all of 2020. And yet emissions only fell, what, 6%?
Yeah, it was like just under 6%.
So
yeah.
and you're like, okay, so now they're saying that we need to do that every year for a decade and then accelerate at that point. Right. I don't know how you guys feel. It's just a sort of like mind-blowing showcase of just what a big project decarbonization really is.
Right. Well, and how systemic it needs to
exactly.
be. It's like, yeah, everybody was home, but they were on their devices, you know, using, I mean, we were still using a shitload of fossil fuels. The main thing that drove reduction in emissions was the lack of air travel.
Yeah.
You know, so it wasn't like people's lives in terms of emissions didn't shift that much apart from long, you know, like commuting. So if people were driving to work, that stopped. And then the air travel thing. So yeah, I'm like, well, yeah, if we don't have a replacement energy source, those emissions aren't going to drop that much. You know?
Yeah. And, you know, here we are, and we're now, you know, we're at a new emissions peak, right? And we're going to have peaks over the next couple of years, and we may even have a new coal peak And, I think this is really, really important. Like it's, it may seem a little bit wonky or like, just like inside baseball, but it's like, there is this sort of narrative out there, which isn't untrue, that there is progress being made. And there is progress being made. Like we now think some of the worst case scenarios are probably less likely than we thought they were a few years ago. And that's because of, for a lot of reasons, a relatively faster decarbonization trajectory seems possible than seemed possible a few years ago. But there's this eagerness, and I even feel it sometimes myself. I'd be curious to know how you guys feel to use that to be optimistic about the state of play, when in fact, literally we're at all-time highs. And
yeah, David, we don't fuck with optimism. We don't. We stay in the rage zone.
But we're in this really weird rhetorical place where we got to talk about the good news on climate, and too bad about the kids who are so anxious, and going to therapy for climate reasons and all that. And yet
what good news? I mean, we I'm sorry, but the most recent IPCC report noted that in the last decade, per capita emissions have gone up higher than they've ever fucking been. So this means that in the time of history, when we have known the absolute most about this problem and what needs to be done to solve it, we have gone in the absolute opposite direction. And that's just the truth. And I really, I don't say that to bum people out or suggest that people stop trying. I say that to make people fucking mad enough to do something. I really... Yeah,
well, then, if you're going in that route, do you mind if I briefly play the quasi-optimist?
Please, go. Yes.
Of course, please.
Yes.
I would say that for a generation, the green transition, the project of decarbonization was really understood at almost all levels as a hard, costly project. For those who believed it was necessary, like the three of us, it was going to also be difficult and burdensome in a economic way, although I don't mean economic defined narrowly. I mean, it's just going to make people's lives worse and they're going to have to do with less and that sort of thing. That was a quite conventional view of what real climate action would require. And, there have been cracks in that philosophy and that view of the challenge for a while now. But I think over the last few years, the rapidly falling cost of renewable energy has really changed almost everyone's view of that dynamic in a way that is encouraging, in the sense that, we are at these peaks. We've done really badly given what we've known about the problem to this point. There are basically no signs of actual concrete progress in the sense of bending curves downward, although in certain countries you can see some of that progress, but at the international level, very much not. On the other hand, it is not insane, I don't think, if you're plotting the likely future of fossil fuel use over the next, 50, 75, 100 years, to feel pretty confident that it's going to decline.
Yeah, I think that's true. Yeah.
The rate is really important. If it declines over 20 years or over 50 years or over 80 years, that really, really matters. But even 5 years ago, it would have felt fantastical to say we're going to get to zero here.
Yeah, that's true. It definitely didn't feel as definite as it does now, where you're this just makes financial sense to do at this point.
And as a result, you have all these politicians who are talking out of both sides of their mouths, yes, and who are still subsidizing fossil fuels, yes, but they're also giving speeches about literally going carbon neutral. And yes, carbon neutral, net zero, those are bullshit terms. All your listeners know this already. But
yes.
They didn't do that 5-10 years ago. And, that means, I think, that we can start to think about the future in a slightly different way, which is to say, we still have locked in an unconscionable level of warming. And I think it's really, really important to keep that in mind at all times. We are inevitably going to be warming beyond levels that were considered acceptable as recently as the Paris Accords. That's inevitable now, and we're going to have to be dealing with the consequences of that, which are going to be huge. But it's also the case that we're probably not going to be looking at 5-6 degrees Celsius of warming this century. And that means that some truly excruciating, disruptive, potentially civilization collapsing level warming is maybe not impossible, but it's just much, much, much less likely. And my own view is we need to keep both of those things in mind at the same time. And I really worry that like our culture, and I see, this is what I was talking about a few minutes ago, our culture, I see signs that our culture is already toggling to like, well, if 5 degrees is off the table, then like we won.
Yeah. I'm seeing that. I'm seeing like, okay, we did it, and scrap all the emissions reductions. Let's just do 100% CDR. And I'm like, guys, come on.
Yeah.
Like the idea
oh my
that,
gosh.
especially actually, I will have to say that like one thing that gave me optimism actually also came from that same IPCC report that was pretty explicit about how bad we've done so far. Like there was a chapter in there that laid out basically like, here's how modern society could work if we measured well-being and people's, they call it like the decent living energy index. Like this really pretty radical idea for like completely re-envisioning how modern society can work. And like, that's something I can't imagine ever reading in an IPCC report. I was like, is this kind of some kind of like post-capitalism visioning document? I don't understand how this got into an IPCC report.
It does seem just like on a practical level that like the scientists have figured out that the policymakers who review, they only review the summary for policymakers. So like they can sneak all this other shit in there.
They let it rip in the rest of the report. I mean, it's wild. But anyway, the fact that like there are a number of well-regarded researchers and enough research on all of the other ways that economies and societies could work to make it into a very, stodgy report like that is somewhat heartening to me too, that there are some indications that people are thinking beyond just plugging their shit into solar instead of coal.
Yeah. I want to go back to the "we are the virus" thing, because every time I hear that come up, I think it's really important to emphasize that it was mostly or disproportionately Black and brown people who were getting sick with the virus, and the eco-fascist undertones of "we are the virus" were just like deeply, deeply concerning. And also humans have existed on this planet in harmony forever and not been a virus.
Right.
So yeah, I feel remiss to not mention that. And also, like, there's this other thing coming up now where there's all this research saying that once white people learned that it was people of color that were getting hit by the pandemic, they tuned out. And now I'm hearing these conversations that maybe we have the same problem with climate change and that we should stop talking about climate justice and environmental justice, because then it'll tip off, these white people or these rich white people that it's people of color who are getting hurt. So why should I care? I have feelings about this, but I'll let you guys go first.
I actually didn't realize that had made its way into the climate conversation too. That's so concerning. But I mean, I don't think it's a question of like not emphasizing that it's people of color who get hurt first and worst, as it is emphasizing that everyone will be impacted by this no matter what. I think, sadly, it seems like one thing we learned with the pandemic is that if people think they're safe, they don't give a shit about other people.
Yeah.
And that's especially true, I think, of rich white Americans. So I think like emphasizing how much this will actually impact them too, that this idea that there's some, I don't know, I still think there's such a prevalent escape hatch mentality amongst wealthy people in this country, like that, you can just build a bunker, you can just go to Mars, or,
Yeah.
And just to get back to something I was saying earlier about the pandemic, it's not just that, it's like the escape hatch becomes more, model of thinking becomes more attractive and makes you feel better about yourself if other people are suffering more. And that's the thing. It's like, it's not just like, well, if we're okay, then I don't care about other people. If we look at what happened in the pandemic, at many different points, we failed to take the measures that could have protected, quote unquote, us, like the Americans or whatever, because they would have also protected other people. Mm-hmm. So we're not just doing the bare minimum to secure the safety and livelihoods of a small group of people who are judged by the international system to be most important. We're actually not maximizing those people's well-being. because maximizing their well-being would mean also doing something to help people living tougher lives elsewhere in the world. And we find that so distasteful that we'd actually rather live ourselves worse lives, but with a bigger gap between us and everybody else, than to do something to help them and reduce that gap, even if it makes us our lives better in the end. And it's really scary and really ugly. And I wrote a piece in the fall about, it's a complicated piece that touched on a lot of different things, but it was basically, talking about global climate justice and trying to put a number on the debt of climate reparations, among other things. And one of the points I made just sort of briefly in that piece was, if you take seriously a lot of these projections for end of century warming that have gotten a little bit better over the last couple of years and say, okay, we're probably going to end up somewhere in the 2 to 3 degree range, then that's like the temperature level at which some northern countries in the world are still going to be benefiting. A lot of the richest countries in the world in the sort of mid-northern latitudes won't be dramatically suffering. They'll be suffering a bit, but they'll be doing okay. And the global south will just be absolutely destroyed. And that is probably not a coincidence. Like, we've engineered a pace of progress that has made that outcome the likeliest outcome. Not one in which we actually, did the most we could to protect the most people in the world. And not even the one in which we did the most we could to protect the well-being of the rich people in the world, but the one in which there was the starkest contrast between the fates of the global rich and the global poor is like just about like where, like that's our bullseye. Like that's where we're probably going to be landing here. And that's just so horrifying and awful.
Yeah.
I'll say about this idea that like we, shouldn't talk about who's getting hurt because it'll make people not care. First of all, it's not just rich white people. I know we were saying that, but a lot of poor white people are just identify more with their race than they do with their economic status.
Right.
And I think this is more evidence that we need to tackle white supremacy as opposed to just don't acknowledge
Change the
it. Just
messaging.
act like it's not there, right? Like, let's just hear no evil, see no evil when it comes to white supremacy. Like, we keep kind of come up with these short-term solutions to dealing with white supremacy, and it just, it doesn't work. We're not going to I think a lot of people think we don't have time to topple white supremacy because climate change is so urgent and the pandemic is so urgent, so we have to find these workarounds. But actually, until you actually deal with it, you will never solve any of those problems. And it's just we refuse to learn from Reconstruction.
Right, exactly. Yeah. I mean, that was the whole jam with white supremacy, was to keep people out of class affiliation, right? Let's weaponize this against any kind of an uprising. And we see it time and time again, over and over.
And, it's on some level, the pandemic shows us a deepening of the same problem in the sense that, if you think about, Peter Singer's model of the expanding circle of empathy, that this was, on some level, the sort of Western civilization's idea about itself, that over time, empathy would extend farther and farther from the smaller unit until it eventually reached all people on the planet and maybe even all creatures and living things on the planet. That was the sort of conceptual sales pitch for global liberalism or whatever. And it's interesting to hear you're talking, Mary, about white supremacy, which is obviously laced through all of this and is a huge problem here. But it's also the case that with the pandemic, there were rich white people who were looking at other rich white people who were dying and being you fucking deserve it. So it's it's rather than if you were hoping for an expanding circle of empathy, it feels in part because we have this, because of the pandemic, because of climate change, we have this growing zero-sum sense of global cooperation. We're shrinking that that circle. That it's not just that we're not expanding it quickly enough. It's in a lot of cases, we're making it smaller and smaller so that even partisanship in the U.S. is functioning in the same spirit that race and class used to. It's not quite there, but it's it just shows that we are we are regarding each other with like so much disdain and animated by so much self-interest that we'll accept so much more suffering and dying, even among the people that, you know, we would have a generation ago, like sort of reflexively considered.
Identified with.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like we can't see the forest for the trees. And speaking of trees, do you know how many apples grow on a tree?
3? Tree? I don't know. What's the answer here?
How many? All of them.
All of them. Yeah.
My day kicks off with a refreshing Celsius energy drink, then straight to the gym. Pre-K pickup, back home to meal prep. Time for my fire station shift. One more Celsius, gotta keep the lights on. When the 3-alarm hits, I'm ready. Celsius. Live, fit, go. Grab a cold, refreshing Celsius at your local retailer or locate now at Celsius.com.
My cat Freddie loves to be brushed and cuddled. But stirring up his cat allergens meant sneezing and itchy eyes. Then I found Purina One Live Clear. It's cat food that reduced the major allergen and my suffering in as little as 21 days. Now, we feel closer than ever. If you have issues with cat allergens, you really need to try Purina One Live Clear.
Try new Purina One Live Clear today. Purina One, a difference from day one.
So I know that you just mentioned this reporting that you did that showed that Russia was actually the hardest hit in terms of these excess death counts. But again, as the war started, we heard that it wasn't the time to talk about climate, wasn't the time to talk about anything but the war, really. So I'm curious, I don't know, just what you think, given the context of COVID deaths and given the context of where we're at with climate, where, like, how you think all of this should be kind of understood or filtered through the context of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the sort of the war and the way the fossil fuel industry is using the war and all of that stuff. I'm curious for your thoughts on this big global thing that's overlaying all of this right now.
Well, first I'll mention something I thought of earlier in our conversation but didn't bring up, which is that I see a real clear parallel in the way that the war in the Ukraine has sort of allowed us to, quote unquote, turn the page on the pandemic, to the way that the pandemic invited us to turn the page on climate change.
Climate. Oh, interesting. Yeah.
And I think that there is this weird psychological dynamic at play at the cultural level, and maybe not necessarily the individual level, where like we do seem to have like a hunger for like the next existential story, and like in part as a way to start thinking of the last one as like resolved, even if that resolution is a terrifying status quo that nobody would have thought was acceptable before. And I find it really striking how like all of our major newspapers are like just full of war coverage, which I mean, I don't mean to say it's not important. It's hugely important, but it's like every lead story in every newspaper now, every day, is about the war in Ukraine. And I'm spending a week with my niece and nephew who are 10 and 7. And it's like really striking to me how much they are thinking about the war as like the story of this year. And it feels like it's really quite fully penetrated the culture, and, you know, often in many ways like allowed us to stop thinking about the things that we were obsessing over 6 or 9 months ago, which is to say the pandemic.
Right.
Now, how it all fits into climate change, I mean, there are a lot of ways to talk about that dynamic, and I'd be curious to hear how each of you are thinking about it. But the few points I would mention are, first of all, I think a really underappreciated feature of this war is that it is the act of a autocratic leader of a petrostate who is, to some degree, watching the world turn away from oil and gas, which have been the lifeblood of his country for the entire period of his reign. And I think there is a sort of like, you know, now or never, shit or get off the pot kind of a Russia may never have the power over the West in particular that it has right now ever again. And 5 years from now, 10 years from now, if this war happened, would they be making a carve out in their sanctions for Russian gas to continue to flow? I don't think so. Like, I think that, we're in a position now where Putin has considerably more power, I think, on those fronts than he would in not even a full generation, but a half generation or so. And I think he probably knows that and understands that. So even, that's the sort of causes of the war. I think there is a climate and energy component to that narrative, not to say that it's the only thing that's driving him to war, but I think it's part of the mix. And then, there's the, what does it mean? And how are we responding? I think on some level, in the longer term, it could be positive in the sense that I think it is teaching everyone, even the most casual consumer of this sort of news, that continued dependence on fossil fuels is really risky and means that we are in bed with some quite ugly people and some quite ugly regimes, and that it's just a sort of another argument for getting off them as quickly as we can, when we can. And, that's not to say that it's going to happen as fast enough for any of our liking, but I do think that the war has, in a sort of medium-term, long-term way, shown us that. The problem is that, nobody making decisions is making decisions on a medium or long-term basis. They're all thinking, very, well, the gas price is going up. We got to scramble to fix that. And the measures they've taken to fix that, I think, are really not just bad on a climate basis, but just bad policy in the sense that almost nothing that Joe Biden or the Biden administration has done to quote unquote address this quote unquote crisis actually is going to reduce the price of gas in the, over the next bunch of months. It's all long-term plays. And you're like, that doesn't.
I mean, yes, I was looking, I've been just watching this news and I'm like, wow, show me you don't know how gas pricing works without telling me you don't know how gas pricing works. Do you really not understand how this works? Because none of this will have a near-term impact, Yeah, it's been very infuriating.
That's the position we're in. We're in this global energy market. And actually, even though we produce enough oil, depending on how you want to think about it, we produce enough oil for ourselves, we actually can't control the price because it's controlled by the market is totally financialized. And that's a whole other separate subject, the way that we're living through an era of crisis, I think, because so much of our world has been financialized in this way.
Right.
It's just they're looking for really short-term political plays, and they're taking them left and right, even when the cost to their own stated climate goals is really quite catastrophic, so, and it's not just in the US, in Europe, in a certain way, they're a little bit more under the thumb, under Russia's thumb when it comes to energy at the moment, but they could be taking the opportunity to much more quickly renewabilize their energy infrastructure. And instead they're bringing in just, giant tankers of US LNG and essentially continuing their fossil fuel dependence rather than taking the crisis as an opportunity to engineer their way out of it.
I spoke with someone in Europe, a youth climate activist who's in Belgium. And I was saying, there are lots of ways that people could reduce the demand for that energy in fairly painless ways, and she said, you would be surprised how many people in all these supposedly socialist European countries are I don't want to turn my thermostat down 2 degrees. That's infringing on my personal freedom. And I was like, no, we've infected the world.
Yeah. Just thinking about the war in Ukraine, the pandemic, and climate change, and one of the things that ties them all together is disinformation. With the war, it's more disinformation in Russia, but also Russia is all up and through science disinformation in the United States. So it's this interesting kind of confluence. And we were talking earlier about how people are well, if you died of COVID, then you deserved it. And it's I think a lot of people think that way about unvaccinated people or people in red states. And hello from a red state, Louisiana over here. It's kind of fucked up. But it's also you leave people's brains to rot watching OAN and Fox News and all of these other things, and you do nothing about it. Yeah, of course, they're going to start to think some crazy shit.
Yeah. I mean, there's a huge disinformation component just from the fossil fuel industry right now too. I mean, there were letters coming from API and they were having meetings and shit way before Putin actually invaded Ukraine. They were like, here's the sanctions we're okay with, here's this, here's that. So like in a very similar way to COVID actually, where they were, I think as early as February and March, the API was sending letters to the White House with its kind of wish list of items for, special carve-outs and incentives and regulatory rollbacks and things like that. They're very, very good at both knowing exactly what to be lobbying for the minute any crisis hits and knowing exactly what message to be pushing out. Because, day one of the invasion, the API was right on top of, how like, this is why we need US fossil fuels, national security, blah, blah, blah. And honestly, I feel like that narrative really took hold of the mainstream media and has not let up. Every single time I see folks talking about this, it's like, well, we have to remember, but the gas prices though, and we have to make sure that, people aren't being gouged at the pump. And it's like, yeah, but none of these things have anything to do with that.
Meanwhile, these are like a lot of the same people who told you 2 years ago that the only solution to climate change was a carbon tax.
Exactly. Yeah. So yeah, it's really gross.
Well, Amy, to get back to your sort of meta perspective, like, not to sound like too much of like a conspiracy theorist with his strings hanging up in his closet or whatever, but
bring it on, David.
I've got my tinfoil hat on right now. I'm ready. Yeah.
But the basic proposition that like our way of life is tied up in our large cars and our large highways and our long commuting distances and our unbelievably irresponsible use of fossil fuels compared to even countries in the world, elsewhere in the world that are richer than us on a per capita basis. Mm-hmm. That's propaganda.
Yeah. Oh, it's propaganda created by the fossil fuel industry. Like that's documented. I don't even have to have the conspiracy is real, Yeah. There's very interesting. In fact, actually just last week, there was a new paper that came out with a bunch of new documents that really showed how actually even, the whole time right alongside science denial, the industry was saying like, we need to hammer on the American way of life, the economic impact, like who can we commission to do a study that will say that this, is going to cost American households, XYZ. And, here are the lifestyle things that we should hammer on. And you still hear it. It's like, they're going to take your burgers and they're going to, do all this stuff. And the whole, I don't know, I feel like the fossil fuel industry was actually way more instrumental in shaping what we even think of as the American way of life than I think most people know.
And so instrumental that, we actually now have to deal with those cultural biases, not as though they're just inventions, but like they're now real.
Totally. Like I think that is maybe one of, if not the biggest blocker to climate action is this really deeply rooted idea that your life will be materially worse if you don't have those things. And yes, systems that make it so, because like there are a lot of places in the country where if you can't drive or don't have a big car, your life is harder, and they have kind of weighed in on that too. But yeah, the other thing I just want to note too on the disinformation front is that a lot of the same exact people and organizations were pushing COVID disinformation that pushed climate disinformation for a long time. I have like a little group of these weird fringy like lone wolf climate denier dudes that like kind of no one takes seriously, but they're good bellwethers for whatever the like new crazy theory is going to be from the right on why we shouldn't do anything about climate. And I saw them starting to tweet stuff about COVID regulations being an infringement on personal freedom and all of this stuff. And it reminded me so much of like, there's all this documentation of how much the fossil fuel industry was freaking out at the end of World War II. And like, they were just like, oh my God, you know, people have gotten used to the government being involved in setting prices and like, you know, like being involved in markets and, you know, the government's done a good job of actually taking care of people. And what are we going to do? All hands on deck. We have to like make sure to remind people that capitalism and the free market system is the most important thing. It is the thing that makes us American. It is the thing that makes us free. And it's like that same messaging came up in all the COVID stuff. And now you see it in all of this, you know, kind of discussion about fossil fuels with respect to Russia and, you know, American independence and national security and all this stuff. It's like the thing that they go back to over and over and over again. And it feels really hard to change. You know? Yeah.
But to go back to something we're, you know, it's a theme we've been talking about throughout this conversation. It's like, you know, it's also the case that the energy pinch here is like going to be much deeper in Europe than in the US. And even those countries, which again, you know, on like an ethnic basis, we like quote unquote identify with, and like a cultural basis, we have like quote unquote affinities for, like, even then we're not even that interested in that story as Americans.
No, not at all. Yeah. Our gas prices now are like what Europeans pay, or like less than what Europeans pay at the pump normally. And we're like, $6. You know what I mean? It's like, I understand that like part of that is because so many people are living in such tight financial circumstances that a couple more dollars a gallon is a very meaningful difference. And it's making the price of groceries go up and all of those kinds of things. But yeah, no one is like those poor Germans, you know?
Well, last question before I let you go is, so climate change is definitely going to bring more pandemics.
Yeah.
We've been talking a lot about how this pandemic influenced climate change, but also like the permafrost is probably going to melt. Heard a lot about this ice sheet that broke pretty recently. Feel like we're always hearing about some ice sheet breaking off in the Arctic. Do we feel like we've learned anything going forward?
Well, I'm coming out of the pandemic, or quote unquote, coming out of the pandemic more dispirited than I certainly was at the beginning. But I'm trying to remember those feelings of measured hope that I had right at the outset, thinking that institutions we had assumed for so long were unmovable showed themselves actually to be quite movable and quite nimble. Now, we also learned what it takes to move them and what motivates that movement. And it doesn't necessarily line up perfectly with the climate agenda. But I think it is on some level still, you know, worth keeping in mind as we dwell in despair on how much worse our global management of the pandemic was than it might have been. And, you know, one other point I would add about that is just that, you know, the vaccines are really pretty incredible, just as like a technological innovation. And they also show us that it's not just the innovation that's important, it's also the rollout, you know, the provisions, the support, you know, all that stuff. But, you know, a few years ago, I might have thought that one challenge we had in trying to deal with climate change was just how stalled a lot of our culture of innovation seemed to be. And I do think that there's a way of looking at what's happened and thinking, at least in some sectors, there's like a lot going on, you know, and biotech is really, they're doing a lot of incredible things. The mRNA vaccines really could open up a whole new horizon, you know, of medical treatment for cancer and tons of other stuff. So I think it's a sort of a mixed lesson, but I, you know, when I try to take it all in and like come to a sort of single conclusion, the thing I always come back to is the thing I started with today is just, you know, we had the chance to protect the world and instead we only chose to protect ourselves. And that's when you're facing down future pandemics or you're facing down, worsening climate change, it's a recipe for disaster and a moral indictment of anyone who's failed to push for more.
Yeah. I'll say that I think that, there's a lot I could say that's dispiriting, but I'll try to leave with the one good thing that I think comes out of the pandemic, was that I think we realized the importance of community. I don't think everybody's doing the right things with their need for community coming out. Some people are out here building up militias. But the rest of us could do better things with the need for community. Like, we understand how important it is, and that is one of the most important things for coping with climate change and actually doing something about it, is understanding that we need each other. I don't know. What about you, Amy?
Same. You took my community point. Yes, totally. Same. That's the one thing that I'm like, well, I did actually see, just in my own very small part of the world, people actually helping each other out in a sort of person to person way that I haven't actually seen in my life in the US. So that gave me a tiny bit of, kind of, okay, well, maybe people are starting to figure this out. It's also like the only kind of climate wins I've seen recently are in like local community kind of ways. So I think that, and actually I thought of another thing when you were talking about the nature stuff and how for a brief moment, people did kind of get this window into how much we are sort of, aggressively dominating nature all the time. I have seen a shift in the climate movement away from the idea that it is silly or naive, I don't know, like feminine in some areas to care about nature. I think that was like a real overcorrection in the climate space. There was a definite need to focus, move away from polar bears to people. But I think there's been a bit of an overcorrection in recent years to being like, fuck nature. And I don't think that's healthy either. So I feel like we have maybe become a bit healthier about our relationship to nature.
So Amy, you're no longer an eco-modernist? Is that what you're saying?
Yes, I've officially removed my name from the Eco-Modernist Manifesto.
Yeah. Well, I'll actually add one more thing, and that is I think it became a lot more normal to be alarmed about stuff. Like before it was like, if you freaked out in public, you were considered hysterical. You were considered an alarmist. Like, David, you dealt with that when you published Uninhabitable Earth. And now it's kind of like, maybe we should be scared of scary things.
True.
I think that's healthy.
True. It is healthy. Although I share, David, your concern that we didn't see a lot of great social stuff coming out of the pandemic.
I would, I see both. It's like, I think what you guys are saying about community, I mean, that's all there too. It's just really messy. And I think just not to like impose another lesson on this like high pile of lessons we're like throwing here in the end, but like, I think we have a tendency to really think about a lot of these challenges in really misleadingly binary ways. So we think like, when it comes to climate, either in overly apocalyptic ways or in overly Pollyanna ways. And with the pandemic, it's like, are we going overboard or do we need to be way more restricted? It's just like, we are living because of so much disruption and mismanagement and social disorder. We are living in a world of complication and uncertainty and in that messy muddle. And I don't see a very good path through that, but I also don't look at the pandemic or climate these days and think, I see a neat story of total disaster. I see a messy story in which there's a lot of good and a lot of encouraging stuff going on too. It's just, in both cases, not sufficient to overcome the negative forces, at least not yet.
Right. Yeah. Awesome. All right. We will release you
Thank you
to
so
bedtime.
much for coming on, David.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Oh my God, it was really a pleasure. I hope we get to catch up again soon. So thanks again for having me. And
good luck with the new gig. We're excited to read your stuff.
Thank you very much. I'll be thinking of you as I'm writing.
Have a good night.
Thank you.
Bye,
Talk
guys.
to you soon.
Hot Take is a Crooked Media production.
It's produced by Ray Pang and mixed and edited by Jules Bradley. Our music is by Vasilis Fotopoulos. Thamali Kodakara is our consulting producer, and our executive producers are Mary Anais Hegler, Michael Martinez, and me, Amy Westervelt.
Special thanks to Sandy Gerard, Ari Schwartz, Kyle Seglin, and Charlotte Landis for production support, and to Amelia Montooth for digital support.
You can follow the show on Twitter at Real Hot Take, sign up for our newsletter at hottakepod.com, and subscribe to Crooked Media's video channel at youtube.com/crookedmedia.